In the winter of 1967, a frail old man died alone in a Beijing hospital ward, his body worn down by decades of humiliation, reinvention, and survival. His name was Asinjioro Puyi, and he had once ruled over 400 million people as the Son of Heaven, the last emperor of the Qing Dynasty, the final link in an unbroken chain of imperial rule stretching back more than 2,000 years. How does the most powerful man in the world end up as a gardener in a communist state, tending cabbages in the same city where he once commanded armies and received the prostrations of ministers who dared not look him in the eye? To understand what happened to Puyi, you have to understand what the Qing dynasty actually was, and why it was already rotting from the inside long before he was born. The Qing were not Han Chinese, they were Manchu, a people from the northeastern forests and plains beyond the Great Wall, who had swept into China in 1644 and seized the Dragon Throne from the collapsing Ming dynasty. For 2.5 centuries, the Manchu emperors had ruled the largest land empire in Chinese history, controlling territories from the steppes of Mongolia to the jungles of Yunnan, from the Tibetan plateau to the ports of Guangdong. At the height of their power under emperors like Kangxi and Qianlong, the Qing court in Beijing was arguably the wealthiest and most sophisticated imperial institution on earth. But by the 19th century, something had gone deeply, structurally wrong, and the cracks were spreading faster than any emperor could plaster over them. The first catastrophic blow came from the sea. In 1839, the Qing government made a decision that seemed morally righteous and administratively sensible, but turned out to be strategically catastrophic. Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu, acting on orders from the Daoguang Emperor, seized and destroyed over 20,000 chests of British opium stockpiled in Guangzhou. The British merchants had been flooding China with the drug for decades, draining Chinese silver and creating addiction on a massive scale. Lin Zexu wrote a remarkable letter to Queen Victoria appealing to her conscience, asking how a civilized nation could profit from poisoning another people. The letter, records suggest, never reached her. Instead, the British government dispatched a naval expedition that exposed the catastrophic military gap between the Qing Empire and the industrializing West. Qing war junks, armed with cannons that had barely changed in 2 centuries, were obliterated by steam-powered warships. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 forced China to cede Hong Kong, open 5 treaty ports, and pay a staggering indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. It was the first of what Chinese historians would later call the unequal treaties, and it set a template that other powers would rush to exploit. And here is where this story gets genuinely strange, because the greatest threat to the Qing dynasty in the mid-19th century did not come from foreign guns, it came from within. In 1850, a failed civil examination candidate from Guangdong province named Hong Xiuquan, who had suffered a mental breakdown and experienced visions, declared himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ and launched a rebellion against the Qing. What followed was not a minor uprising. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, as Hong called his movement, captured Nanjing in 1853 and held it for over a decade. The Taiping Rebellion lasted from 1850 to 1864, and by the most conservative scholarly estimates, killed somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. Some historians place the death toll closer to 70 million. It remains one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, and most people in the Western world have never heard of it. That single fact tells you something important about whose history gets told and whose gets buried. The Qing survived the Taiping, but only barely, and only because regional Han Chinese commanders like Zheng Gufan raised their own armies, funded through local taxation, and fought the rebels with a ferocity and organizational discipline that the regular Qing banner forces could no longer muster. The dynasty was saved, but the price was a fundamental shift in power. The center could no longer hold. Provincial military commanders now had armies, revenues, and loyalties that were theirs, not the emperor's. The Qing court in Beijing had become dependent on men it could not fully control. That dependency would prove fatal, but not for another 4 decades. If you find this kind of deep dive into the real machinery of Chinese history compelling, the stories that get left out of textbooks and mainstream documentaries, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Every video we make is built on primary sources, documented records, and the kind of analytical honesty that the subject demands. Subscribe now and join the people who want to understand what actually happened. By the 1890s, the court was dominated by one of the most controversial figures in Chinese history, the Empress Dowager Cixi. She had entered the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine in 1851, and through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and extraordinary political instinct, she had maneuvered herself into a position of effective regent over the empire for nearly half a century. Cixi is often portrayed in Western accounts as a reactionary villain who blocked modernization and destroyed reformers, and there is truth in that portrait. But the reality is more complicated. She was operating within a system of court factions, Manchu privilege, foreign pressure, and institutional inertia that would have paralyzed almost anyone. She was also a woman exercising power in a patriarchal imperial system that had no legitimate role for her, which meant every decision she made had to be wrapped in layers of political theater and careful manipulation. The 1894 to 1895 Sino-Japanese War was the moment when the dynasty's weakness became impossible to deny. Japan, which had been modernizing aggressively since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, crushed the Qing military in a conflict over influence in Korea. The Beiyang fleet, which had been built at enormous expense over the previous 2 decades and was supposed to represent China's modern naval power, was destroyed at the Battle of the Yalu River. The Treaty of Shimonoseki forced China to cede Taiwan, the Penghu Islands, and the Liaodong Peninsula, and to pay an indemnity of 200 million taels of silver. The shock to Chinese intellectual and official culture was profound. If Japan, a country that had always been a cultural borrower from China, could modernize and defeat the empire in a matter of months, then the Qing system itself was the problem. This realization produced the 100 Days Reform of 1898. The young Guangxu emperor, who had been under Cixi's thumb since childhood, suddenly surrounded himself with reformers, most notably the scholar Kang Yuwei and his brilliant student Liang Qichao. Between June and September of 1898, Guangxu issued a cascade of edicts that would have transformed China, modernizing the military, reforming the examination system, establishing new schools, streamlining the bureaucracy. For exactly 103 days, it seemed like the dynasty might actually save itself. Then Cixi struck. She had Guangxu placed under house arrest on an island in the imperial lake complex, a prisoner in his own palace, for the remaining 10 years of his life. 6 of the reformers were executed. Kang Yuwei and Liang Qichao fled into exile. The reforms were annulled and the window closed. What happened next was, in retrospect, almost suicidal. In 1900, Cixi made the extraordinary decision to support the Boxer Uprising, a violent anti-foreign movement whose members believed, sincerely, that their ritual exercises made them immune to bullets. The Boxers, formerly the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, had been attacking foreign missionaries and Chinese Christians throughout northern China. When Cixi effectively declared war on all the foreign powers simultaneously, the response was the 8-nation alliance, troops from Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the United States, Japan, Austria-Hungary, and Italy marching on Beijing. The Forbidden City was looted. Cixi fled the capital disguised as a peasant woman, reportedly in a cart, the Son of Heaven's regent reduced to hiding in the dust of a country road. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 imposed an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, a sum so enormous it was calculated to equal 1 tael for every person in China, a deliberate humiliation. The Qing were now so financially strangled that meaningful reform was nearly impossible to fund. And yet, paradoxically, the decade after the Boxer catastrophe was the period of the dynasty's most ambitious modernization effort. Cixi, chastened and frightened, actually began implementing many of the reforms she had crushed in 1898. The traditional examination system, which had been the backbone of Chinese governance for over 1,000 years, was abolished in 1905. New military academies were established. Constitutional government was promised. A constitutional commission was sent to study systems in Japan, Germany, and elsewhere. The irony is almost painful. The reforms that might have saved the dynasty came too late, implemented by a government that had spent decades destroying the credibility needed to make reform believable. Cixi died in November 1908, and records indicate she had the Guangxu emperor poisoned the day before, almost certainly to prevent him from outliving her and reversing her decisions. Modern forensic analysis of Guangxu's hair, conducted in 2008, confirmed lethal levels of arsenic. She died having chosen her successor, a 2-year-old boy named Asin Jioro Puyi. His father, Prince Chun, became regent, and so the last chapter began. Puyi was brought to the Forbidden City in December 1908. He was terrified. He screamed and cried throughout the enthronement ceremony, and his father reportedly whispered to him that it would all be over soon. It was meant to be reassuring. It turned out to be prophetic. The child emperor sat on the dragon throne in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, surrounded by incense smoke and the prostrations of officials in embroidered robes, and the entire apparatus of 2,000 years of imperial ritual performed itself around a sobbing toddler. The contrast between the grandeur of the ceremony and the helplessness of its central figure was not lost on observers. It was a metaphor for the dynasty itself. The revolution came 3 years later, and it came from a place the court had barely been watching. In October 1911, a bomb accidentally exploded in a revolutionary cell's headquarters in Hankou, in Wuhan. The revolutionaries, members of the Tongmenghui organization founded by Sun Yat-sen, were forced to act before they were ready. They seized the Wuhan garrison. Other provinces, one after another, declared independence from the Qing. The dynasty's new Western-trained armies, the new army that the court had spent years building, largely refused to fight for the emperor. Many of their officers were themselves secret members of revolutionary organizations. By December 1911, 15 of China's 22 provinces had seceded. The regent, Prince Chun, turned in desperation to the one man who might be able to save the dynasty, Yuan Shikai, the powerful general who had betrayed the Guangxu emperor's reformers in 1898 and had been building his own military-political network ever since. Yuan Shikai's role in what followed is one of the great studies in political cynicism in modern history. He was appointed prime minister and given command of the Beiyang army, the most powerful military force in China. He had the leverage to crush the revolution. He chose instead to negotiate. He played the revolutionaries and the court against each other simultaneously, extracting maximum concessions from both sides. Sun Yat-sen, who had been in the United States fundraising when the revolution broke out and had rushed back to be named provisional president of the new Chinese Republic, agreed to step aside in favor of Yuan Shikai if Yuan could bring about the emperor's abdication peacefully. Yuan presented the court with terms. The court, surrounded by a dynasty that had already ceased to exist in most of the country, had no real choice. On February 12, 1912, Empress Dowager Longyu, acting as regent for the 6-year-old Puyi, signed the abdication decree. The document was carefully worded to suggest that the Qing were voluntarily transferring the mandate of heaven to the new republic, preserving a fiction of legitimacy for both sides. Puyi was allowed to retain his imperial title, to continue living in the northern half of the Forbidden City, to receive an annual stipend of 4 million taels, and to be treated by the Republic with the protocol due to a foreign sovereign. It was an extraordinarily generous arrangement, and it was also completely unworkable. The Republic was broke, the stipend was almost never paid in full, and the spectacle of an emperor holding court in the middle of a Republican capital was a permanent source of political embarrassment and instability. Here is the detail that most accounts skip over. Inside the Forbidden City after 1912, almost nothing changed. The eunuchs still served. The court rituals still proceeded. Officials still prostrated themselves before the boy emperor. Puyi received tutors, including a remarkable Scottish teacher named Reginald Johnston, who introduced him to Western literature, bicycles, and the idea that there was a world beyond those red walls. Puyi had a telephone installed. He rode his bicycle through the imperial gardens. He corresponded with the outside world. He was educated in two completely incompatible worldviews simultaneously: the Confucian imperial tradition that told him he was the center of the universe, and the modern world that was rapidly making that tradition irrelevant. The psychological damage was immense and lasting. The arrangement collapsed in 1924. A warlord named Feng Yuxiang, who had converted to Christianity and was known for baptizing his troops with a fire hose, staged a coup in Beijing and sent soldiers to the gates of the Forbidden City with an ultimatum. Puyi had 24 hours to leave. The imperial household scrambled. Puyi, now 18 years old, was expelled from the only home he had ever known with a few hours' notice. He took refuge in the Japanese legation quarter. The treasures of the Forbidden City, accumulated over 5 centuries, were inventoried by Republican officials who found, to their fury, that enormous quantities of art and valuables had already been systematically removed and sold by court officials over the preceding decade. The scale of the theft was staggering. records from the subsequent investigation suggest that thousands of irreplaceable artifacts had been quietly fenced to antique dealers in Beijing and Shanghai. What Puyi did next tells you everything about his character, or perhaps about the impossible position he had been placed in since birth. Denied the throne, denied even his home, he turned to the only power that seemed interested in restoring him: Japan. He moved to Tianjin, where he lived in the Japanese concession, surrounded by Japanese advisors, Japanese intelligence officers, and Japanese promises. When Japan invaded Manchuria in September 1931, manufacturing the Mukden incident as a pretext, Puyi saw his opportunity. In 1932, the Japanese installed him as the nominal head of the puppet state of Manchukuo, the Japanese-controlled territory carved out of northeastern China. In 1934, he was given the title of emperor again. The Manchukuo period is the darkest chapter of Puyi's life, and also the most morally complicated. He was not entirely unwilling. He genuinely believed or convinced himself that the Japanese would eventually restore him to the dragon throne in Beijing. But he was also a prisoner in a gilded cage, with Japanese advisors controlling every aspect of governance, Japanese officers commanding the military, and Japanese corporations systematically stripping Manchuria's resources for the war effort. The people of Manchuria lived under a brutal colonial occupation, forced labor, opium distribution as a tool of social control, and the activities of Unit 731, the Japanese biological warfare unit operating in Harbin, were all happening within the territory Puyi nominally ruled. How much he knew, and how much he could have done had he known, remains a question that historians continue to debate. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945 and invaded Manchuria with terrifying speed. The Kwantung Army, Japan's elite force in the region, collapsed within days. Puyi was attempting to flee to Japan when Soviet paratroopers captured him at a Mukden airfield on August 19, 1945. He spent the next 5 years in Soviet detention in a facility in Siberia, where he was reportedly well treated and spent considerable time writing. The Soviets were keeping him as a potential asset, a former emperor who might be useful in the political reshaping of post-war Asia. When the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War and established the People's Republic in October 1949, the Soviets transferred Puyi to Chinese custody. What happened next was something that had almost no precedent in modern history. The communist government did not execute Puyi. They subjected him to a decade of political re-education at the Fushan War Criminals Management Center in Liaoning Province. The process was called thought reform, and it was systematic, patient, and psychologically intensive. Puyi was required to write detailed confessions, to study Marxist theory, to confront the suffering caused by the regimes he had been part of. He was also, according to his own later memoir and the accounts of prison officials, genuinely transformed by the experience, or at least performed a transformation so convincing that it served the same function. In 1959, Mao Zedong granted him a pardon. Puyi was released at the age of 53, having spent most of his adult life in captivity of one form or another. He became a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Garden. He took public buses. He stood in queues at the market. He visited the Forbidden City as a tourist and paid the admission fee like everyone else. He married a nurse named Li Shuxian, his fifth wife, in 1962. He was given a job as a researcher at the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, writing historical documents. He published his memoir, From Emperor to Citizen, in 1964, a work that was partly a genuine reflection and partly a piece of communist political literature, the line between the two being impossible to draw cleanly. He died of kidney cancer on October 17, 1967, at the age of 61, in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, a movement that was busy destroying the very historical artifacts and institutions that his dynasty had created. The long-term consequences of the Qing collapse ripple through Chinese history in ways that are still being felt. The fall of the dynasty did not produce the stable republic that Sun Yat-sen had dreamed of. It produced a decade of warlordism, a brutal Japanese invasion, a civil war that killed millions, and ultimately a communist revolution that reshaped the entire social order. The unequal treaties that had humiliated the Qing were not fully abrogated until 1997, when Hong Kong was returned to China. The territorial questions raised by the Qing collapse over Tibet, over Xinjiang, over Taiwan, remain among the most sensitive and contested issues in contemporary Chinese and international politics. The Communist Party's claim to be the restorer of Chinese sovereignty and dignity after a century of humiliation is directly rooted in the story of the Qing's failure. Understanding Puyi is not a matter of historical curiosity. It is a prerequisite for understanding the political psychology of modern China. There is something almost unbearable about Puyi's story when you look at it closely. He was selected for a role he never chose, given absolute power at an age when he could not understand it, and then had that power stripped away before he was old enough to use it. He was educated in contradictions, imprisoned by circumstances, manipulated by everyone from Manchu court officials to Japanese intelligence officers to Soviet interrogators to Communist Party theorists. Every institution he trusted betrayed him. Every identity he was given was eventually taken away. And yet he survived, which is more than can be said for many of the people around him. The last empress, Wanrong, died of opium addiction and starvation in a Jilin prison in 1946. The Manchukuo Prime Minister, Zhang Jingwei, was executed. Thousands of Manchu bannermen, the hereditary military caste that had ruled China for 2.5 centuries, were scattered and impoverished, their identity suppressed, their language nearly extinct. The Qing Dynasty's collapse was not simply the result of foreign aggression, or imperial incompetence, or revolutionary ideology, though all three played their roles. It was the result of a structural failure to adapt a system of governance that had been built for a pre-industrial, pre-nationalist world to the demands of the 20th century. The dynasty tried to reform too late, trusted the wrong people at the wrong moments, and ultimately could not reconcile the contradictions at its core: a Manchu ruling class governing a Han majority, an agrarian fiscal system trying to fund an industrial military, a Confucian ideological framework struggling to accommodate science, democracy, and nationalism. These are not exotic historical problems. They are the problems of every empire that has ever tried to survive its own obsolescence. Puyi tending his cabbages in Beijing in the 1960s is one of history's most extraordinary images, not because it is tragic, though it is, but because of what it represents. A man who had been addressed as the Son of Heaven, who had sat on the dragon throne in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, who had commanded the prostrations of ministers and the obedience of millions, reduced to the simple, honest work of growing things in the earth. Whether that reduction was a punishment, a liberation, or simply the long, grinding logic of history working itself out, is a question that does not have a clean answer. What is certain is that the world that made Puyi possible, that required an emperor, that needed a son of heaven to stand at the center of the universe and give it meaning, was gone. And no individual, however powerful, however determined, however brilliantly advised, could have held it together once the foundations had crumbled. The last emperor lost everything not because he was uniquely weak, but because he was the last man standing in a structure that had already fallen.